Okay, we're going to pick up where we left off in class talking about the Dada movement in Berlin, which relied very heavily on photo collage. This is typical Dada in outlook, in that a lot of what we saw with Dada relied on illogical juxtapositions of objects, going all the way back to Duchamp's early ready-mades, a sort of juxtaposition that calls into question the original meaning of the things that are juxtaposed with each other, that violates the original use of those objects. And we can think of photo collage as really kind of doing exactly the same thing. That the individual images end up sort of meaning something different in the new context because of the way they've been separated from their original environment and repositioned in this new amalgam of imagery. For Hannah Hoke and for George Gross, I think they still maintain some of their original meaning. Unlike Duchamp, he's not trying to create a new thought for the object. He's just trying to repurpose it for something different, but still maintaining some of those linkages with the original works. Another Berlin Dada artist is John Hartfield, and here we see very politically charged work by him. He was very good friends with George Gross. In fact, in Hannah Hoke's collage, it's the two-headed ballerina that we talked about. Is the heads are George Gross and John Hartfield. They were very, very good friends and worked, in fact, together. I'm sorry about the typo. It's Hartfield, not Hartfield. Like Gross, he anglicized his name. He was born Helmut Herzfeld, and in protest to World War I, he made it into an English-sounding name, John Hartfield. During the war, they had worked together, writing out the war, and in fact, they took together photo collage and took it to the next step. They took it to what we now call photo montage. And the difference between a photo collage and a photo montage is that a photo collage is a singular object. So Hannah Hoke's image on the left exists in only one copy. But a photo montage, you take that collage that you've made and you photograph it. And then you use the darkroom to sort of remove any of the seams between the different parts. It's kind of like photoshopping in a way. Proto-photoshopping, making a believably realistic image out of these out of the original photo collage. So photo montage, not only does it make it more realistic looking, but it also gives you the opportunity to reproduce your images. You're not left with a singular work of art. For Hartfield, this is incredibly important because Hartfield wants to use his works to make social critique, which we've seen in other Berlin artists is a very important issue, right? The issue of social critique, and certainly Gross, his good friend Gross, was deeply involved in using art for social justice, and that's the case with Hartfield as well. So, with this picture on the right, he's talking about the fact that the newspapers tend not to report all of the news. That if you read only one kind of press, the bourgeois newspapers, then you become deaf and blind, and it will mask your ability to see and hear. He's suggesting not that all of the press is bad, but rather that one needs to get a balance of one's news inputs in order to maintain sight and hearing and sort of a good sense of the world. Obviously, very political. He's quite anti-Nazi. Here, Adolf the Superman. His esophagus is nothing but a line of gold coins. He's been swallowing gold, the idea that he's being paid off to say these horrifying things. In the early 30s, is a Nazi swastika for a heart in this X-ray. But again, it's a photo collage that's been then itself re-photographed and thus can be printed up in multiples. And this is exactly what John Hartfield did. He tacked these up around the streets of Berlin. I don't know if they had a title on them or not. I don't think they really need one. They're so obvious in what the intentional message is. Adolf, his heart is filled with Nazism because he's been paid for it. And this political activity landed Hartfield at number 5 on the Gestapo's most wanted list. He was really sort of a focus of Nazi ire. And in fact, he was almost captured in 1933. They were after him because of these images. And as they came to the door at night, he jumped through the window. And that was only on the ground floor, but still it was high enough up that he sprained his ankle, limped off into the night, barely escaping death camps. Fled first to Czechoslovakia and then eventually via England. He eventually landed in the United States, where he continued his career well into the 50s and 60s. Dada was everywhere in Germany, and that's certainly because Germany had such a profound impact from the war. And we've talked about this on so many different fronts. Not only the desire to rebuild Germany that we saw with the Bauhaus, but then there's the sort of profound displeasure with where the war had led the country. And we saw this with the new objectivity movement, and now also with Dada. And there's more Dada outposts in Germany than just about anywhere else. That part of that owes to the fact that Germany didn't have a single art center like France does, where there's Paris, right, or America for that matter, where there's New York. In Germany, each of the individual cities had a sort of vibrant art community, and so Dada springs up in each of these different art communities all over. But again, each of them very much sort of in reaction to the war. And Kurt Schwitters is in the city of Hanover. And he's really kind of the center of it there. It really is the Dada movement in Hanover, although he himself said that he wasn't all that much Dada, even though he had taken up the title. And we can see, in fact, on this image, when we look at it more closely, that Dada is there. The word Dada is included within this. So he's taking the term, but he's denying it, which I guess is kind of a Dada thing to do. Like other Dada works we've seen, it's a collage of randomly found things. So these are Dada issues, the idea of taking things that don't belong together and putting them together. Illogical juxtapositions that call into question the original meaning and use of the object, that give it some other form of meaning by its reuse. The randomness of the location of these objects, these are all very Dada things. And what Schwitters does is he takes these, and they're all printed papers. That's what he uses. He doesn't use photographs. He doesn't use three-dimensional objects often. Sometimes they're three-dimensional, but on the norm, they're printed papers. And so here we see stamps, for example, and we'll look elsewhere, and they're overworked by painting over the top of it, collaging other papers underneath it, stenciling, in this case, the Dada movement in French, Mouvement Dada, Movement Dada, a canceller's, a postman's stamp over the top of the stamp. And you can see Zurich there. I don't know if this is an actual envelope or if he had the stamp itself stamping on top of his work. But you can see then paint over that, pencil drawn over everything's been reworked. And he calls this process Merzing. And it comes from the German word commerce, Kommerz. And he titles all of his works Märzbilder, Märzbild singular. In this case, Märzbild 31b. Really, the idea is that Merzing, as he calls it, this collaging of found papers, is itself the most important thing. And it will result in multiple variations on this. But then he adds sort of a subtitle, in this case, Radiating World, to that title. Now, the idea of Merzing and the fact that it comes from the word commerce, Kommerz, and the title Radiating World, this is a clue to his agenda. This is a clue to his meaning. He sees this as a commentary on commercialism, commercialism, and in particular on the idea that paper currency has no value. So, for example, here we see two stamps, and of course, stamps are legal tender, right? You give, in this case, 5 or 10 marks, and you get a stamp. It has the same sort of commercial value as paper money does. Elsewhere in the image, we have receipts, we have tickets. All of them are paper things that stand in value for something else, right? You give something, you get paper in return, and in many ways, these are things without any real value, right? And uh, much of this was meant to be a commentary on rampant inflation, on the devaluing of paper currencies, right? But the idea is, of course, that's one half of it. That's the Merzbild half of it. The other half of it is now giving it this title like radiating world. And in fact, all of his larger Merzbilder, like this one in the Phillips, and there's about 10 or so of these, all of them have titles that suggest cosmic forces, the heavens. And the titles are meant to suggest that these devalued paper objects and from society, these elements of commercialism, which have no real value in themselves. Commercialism has a lack of value, right? But when the artist gets a hold of them, the artist transforms them, they become heavenly, right? That what the artist can do is take the things of the world, the valueless things of the world, and he can make them spiritual. He can make them heavenly. And I think this is a wonderful thing about Schwitter's. In addition to his keen graphic sense, these I think are beautiful compositions. They owe a little bit to constructivism with the sharp angles. They have a lot of energy. The way that triangle juts in from the upper left corner, and is that one sphere, perfectly drawn sphere, just to the right of that. Upper right from 825, is that the radiating world, or are all of these angles, these sort of cubist shapes that intersect, are radiating worlds? It's not really important. The important thing, of course, is that he's created a world uh, radiating, right, moving outward from the physical sphere, from these lost elements, I should say found elements of a devalued commercial world. Our last Dada outpost is in the city of Cologne. I've given you the English spelling here versus Köln. And Max Ernst is the artist most associated with the Dada movement in Cologne. Again, remember that Germany doesn't have a single art center, and furthermore, most Germans were deeply, deeply impacted by the war. What Max Ernst does is, again, very Dada in outlook. He makes rubbings from various surfaces. So he goes out and he just lays the paper down on different rough surfaces, rubs over them with crayon or chalk or graphite. And again, we could talk about this as being found objects in a way. He's capturing it, the object, onto his paper, but more or less by chance, that great Dada idea of chance. And he calls this process frottage, which is French. Frotter in French means to rub. So these rubbings, right? And for Ernst, frottage means more than just the rubbing. What frottage did for him was to provide an open start. Now, we've seen this in other artists, art, for example, right? But here, the rubbings give him a matrix, and then he looks hard at the different juxtapositions of surfaces, because again, it's about juxtaposition. And what he sees in the surfaces juxtaposing is something else begins to emerge. He looks for objects, motifs, themes within the different rubbed elements. And then what he'll do is he'll go back in the studio and he'll draw over the top of those, to bring out the forms that he's located, that have sort of miraculously appeared as the different rubbed patterns combine, right? In this case, it's a pair of birds, uh, conjugal diamonds, he calls them. But the idea of conjugality, right, is that these are two birds that are mating. rubbing against each other, which is interesting because it's a frottage. And again, we've seen so many times in Dada art, Man Ray, for example, Duchamp in particular, Picabia. We've seen great interest in sort of sexual imagery. And in this particular case, Max Ernst is no different. These are copulating birds, conjugal diamonds. And what's interesting is that even in the 20s, the word frottage had a dual, triple meaning. Since it means to rub, it also meant to sort of rub up against somebody, twerking or grinding, sort of creepy things men do on the subway, for example. That was called also frottage in French, and so I think Ernst knows that double entendre, and he uses the rubbings and the pairing of the rubbings to give us now this pairing of the birds. These then became the basis for a series of etchings that he did, where he took those motifs and reworked them on the etching plate, where he uses acid to bite these patterns into the plate. And you'll notice that even though he's changed the basic composition, the birds are not as deeply entwined as they were. He still maintains that sense of a rubbed surface. He's probably doing this through what we call soft ground, where he can take a surface and push it into the ground and remove some of it and then etch that. But you can see that there's some fabric-like forms on either side that pick up the sense of a surface quality, almost look like wood grain that have been etched into the plate. And again, it's that sense of a found object, of something out there being now juxtaposed by the artist to give it new meaning. So again, Dada takes on many different forms, but there are certain shared themes we've seen everywhere in looking at Dada works.